Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today to the Orthodox Christian Attorney Network's webinar on Orthodox Christians and the Rights Revolution. I'm Deacon Ken Liu, and I'm the Executive Director of OCAN. If you're new to us, we are an organization of Orthodox attorneys with a threefold mission of helping attorneys to integrate our faith into the practice of law, to serve the Orthodox Church, and to impact the world with the love of Christ. We are very pleased to have with us today Father Anthony Rober, Emeritus Professor of Early Modern History and Religious Studies at Penn State University, and currently Professor of Church History at St. Vladimir's Seminary. Father Anthony has taught in various universities in North America and Germany, and was the past president of the Orthodox Theological Society in America. And he is the author or editor of numerous books, including Changing Churches, Oxford Handbook of Early Modern Theology, Mixed Marriages in Orthodox History, Human Rights versus Religious Rights, and the one we're going to be talking about today, Orthodox Christians and the Rights Revolution. Father Anthony is not a lawyer, but he sure knows a lot about legal history, and we are very pleased to have him with us today. If you have questions, feel free to enter your questions into the chat box, but Father will reserve plenty of time for open discussion, so hopefully we'll get some engagement from everyone. Father Anthony, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much for arranging this, Father Deacon. I appreciate it very much. I'm very interested in hearing from people who are in the legal profession about what I've tried to do here. So we sort of agreed in advance. So what I would do is to take just a very few minutes at the beginning just to give you some background about myself, about how I got into this project, and then say just a little bit about the book, why it's set up the way it is. And the main issue that we were sort of interested in was to move to some questions about, in a certain sense, why the Orthodox are perhaps a bit late coming to engage with some of these questions that I raised in the book. I do offer my own opinions about that, but that's really a matter for discussion, not so much. I do not want to spend our time together lecturing. I'd like to avoid that and like to discuss as much as possible. So let me begin by saying that I do, in fact, I'm going to actually be taking this from a piece that I put on the Public Orthodoxy website actually a year ago on the 2nd of February. They asked me to actually explain how I came into this project. And so if you want to look at that yourself, it's actually February the 2nd, 2024. And I'm only going to say something briefly about this. This gives you much more background than we need to talk about. But as the deacon said, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a practicing attorney. But I actually began my academic career by studying English common law, the application of law as it was transferred to the British colonies of North America. My first work was done with Professor Gordon Wood, who's a major figure in the history of the founding and of the early laws and constitutions of the North American British colonies. And my first book was actually on the emergence of the legal profession in colonial Virginia. So I began my interest in the law really from the English common law tradition. A second project that I then undertook actually forced me to get very deep into Roman law and to the law on the continent, because what I did was to then begin to explore how people who emigrated to the British colonies from the German-speaking parts of Europe, who had therefore a very, very different legal tradition, a mix of both Roman law that was being imposed over the centuries and village or tribal law that had governed village practices for a long time. And the question I tried to raise was, well, what did these people do when they had to encounter the emphasis in political discourse on liberty, property? What does that mean to you if you don't come out of that particular tradition? And that was basically the basis for a second book-length project. And in that process, then obviously I had to acquaint myself fairly deeply with Roman law, both ancient and its development later in the West. And it was that then that began to raise my interest in sort of looking at how the questions of religious identity and legal mechanisms and so forth actually intersected for various people. And somewhere around the year 2006, I had the really great fortune to become acquainted first with John Whitty, who is, many of you probably know, is one of the founders of the organization that's centered in the law school at Emory University, a center for the study of law and religion. And in the process of talking to him and also to Telly Papanikolaou, who teaches, of course, at Fordham at the Christian Studies Center, I began to be interested in the question of rights talk as it would apply to the Orthodox, partly because I was interested in this, but I wasn't really finding very much that actually talked about how the Orthodox in North America grappled with these kinds of questions. It's what happens when they start to arrive here and they have to adjust themselves to a tradition that obviously is somewhat foreign to them. So that's the sort of really quick background to my work. I after I finished my work in my doctorate, I spent 2 years in Germany, in Berlin, on a Humboldt fellowship, and that was where I really was able to devote myself full time to reading both Roman and Germanic law. That actually then formed the basis for trying to do this comparative study that I did. So that's, as I say, a very quick background in terms of how I came into the project as it was. Obviously, what also influenced this whole project was I myself, 25 years ago, became Orthodox. And so that really, in a certain sense, forced me to sort of reassess and to sort of look at how Orthodox people have viewed questions about law, rights, privileges, and so forth in what is sort of mistakenly called the West. I think there is probably no such thing as the West any more than there is the Enlightenment. There are multiple varieties of that you have to be careful about. But that actually then gave me the impetus for beginning to look at this question. And it's been a very long project precisely because it required me to do work in both case law, a few constitutional decisions, of course, but private papers, public papers that basically then try to set the background for this. So the book itself is set up in such a way that I hope is helpful in the long run, because one of the things I start with in the book is to explain that I think that people make claims about rights without being sometimes very precise about what exactly they mean. And the term human rights is really being invoked now all over the place for a whole bunch of claims that perhaps more accurately would be understood as legal rights or constitutional rights. You might call some of them even moral rights claims. So the book actually begins with a section that I decided to call a rights primer. And so what it does is to basically look at the origins of sort of rights language in the Roman tradition, the Roman Republic, and of course the Roman Empire, and how this actually then also influences the talk about rights within the church itself as it becomes part of the Roman imperial system. This has a profound impact on the role of bishops, for example. And so you get into a rather difficult area where you have to decide what to make of certain claims that some people would say probably isn't best understood as just rights, but privileges, honors, obligations. The word presbeia in Greek actually has many different sort of subtle meanings, but definitely rights is one of them. And so the question of who has rights and obligations within the church becomes an important part of the discussion as well. It's not simply a question of how do people who are interested in religious rights relate to authorities in the political sphere. That's obviously something that the book looks at. But there's an internal question that's going on as well. And that becomes acute in the North American context, as almost all of you would know. The question about who has the right, in a sense of precedence in the North American church, who has the right to claim or to give autocephaly, who has the right to preside over certain sorts of things. These issues have basically haunted the experience of the Orthodox in North America. ever since the 1840s, when actually the Russian mission establishes its first episcopacy here with Saint Innocent, who becomes, in fact, the first bishop on the North American continent before his return to Moscow. And so the book actually then proceeds chronologically to try to say, well, okay, let's go back and do this rights primer, look at the various strands that go into rights thinking. That requires getting into not only ancient Roman business, but medieval debates over rights in the Latin West. And then how the Orthodox themselves began, by the time of the 17th and 18th century, to become aware of this, and to a certain limited degree, this kind of talk does, in fact, influence some Orthodox thinkers, particularly in the Greek tradition. And progressively, then the book moves to a look at primarily the American experience. What happens with the planting of the Russian mission in 1794 in Alaska? When that territory becomes part of the United States, this immediately raises all kinds of discussions about rights and privileges, the rights of Russians who decide to stay in this United States territory, the rights of those people who we would call Creoles, who are the result of marriages between Russian Orthodox and First Peoples. And then what about the rights of the First Peoples themselves? How are they to be understood? What rights and privileges attached to them? Should they be moved to full citizenship? And if so, under what conditions would that happen, and what would be the consequences of that? And in that, of course, the question of marriage and proper understandings of Orthodox marriage become a part of that discussion. This becomes intensified because of the arrival of particularly of Presbyterian ministers and missionaries in the latter part of the 19th century. And the book tries to look carefully at that conflict and to sort of spell out then the consequences of that issue. So all of that basically, is sort of background before you hit the sort of the huge impact of immigration in the late 19th century, which actually changes the whole nature of the Russian mission, because obviously it has to confront now not the First Peoples of America, which was the original question, that the purpose of the mission, but rather what do you do now with all these people who are arriving from Central and Eastern Europe, the Mediterranean, people coming from the Ottoman Empire. This causes, of course, an enormous shift in the whole discussion, because many of these people, of course, in the absence of a hierarchy, in the absence of adequate clergy, they build the churches. They purchase the property. The laity basically looks around and says, well, this is what other people do. This is particularly what the Protestant churches are doing. So obviously, we have the right basically to acquire the property and construct these buildings. And so then what happens when a bishop shows up and says, well, actually, in terms of rights, these belong to me. Unfortunately, as most of you know, American church case law in the 19th century only recognizes two basically forms of organization. You're either a congregational polity or you are an episcopal polity, because those are the two categories that they had worked with. And the Orthodox actually don't fit quite easily into either one, partly because there is no extensive hierarchy in 19th century US. So this becomes, again, one of those very interesting areas where the rights of the Orthodox laity versus that of the episcopacy, the clergy in general, this becomes, again, a part of the unsettled nature of the conflict over rights claims. So all of that happens before you can get to the 20th century issues that begin to emerge with what some people call the rights revolution, starting in the 1960s, with perhaps even earlier with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which really begins to put civil rights at the very forefront of many discussions in the US context. And so beginning with that, then we can finally start talking about civil rights, the question of women's rights. Then you get into questions of marriage and sexuality. And only after a lot of that can you begin to say, well, what happens when the Orthodox finally encounter the question of human rights? And if there's anything that's slightly original or maybe contributory in this survey I've done, I did try to spend a fair amount of time reconstructing carefully the role of an Arab-speaking philosopher and diplomat, Charles Malik. Malik was someone who has a very interesting career, and I tried very hard to reconstruct his background, his family background, to understand why he comes to be part of this commission that is set up at the United Nations to construct what eventually becomes the Universal Declaration. Malik has been misidentified, partly because of his brothers, two of whom actually become Roman Catholic priests. He does not. He's very, very clearly part of the Room Orthodox. He's very explicit about this in his writings. So I spent a fair amount of time sort of exploring his approach to the question of human rights in comparison with some other figures in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, before we can then say, well, then finally, when various theologians begin to look at this question of human rights, how does this fit into this larger story that I've tried to construct? And I take the narrative up to pretty much the present. That is up into the questions that have been raised now about rights with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and some of the consequences of internal debates within the church in North America that continue to talk about the question of rights and precedence among the episcopacy, but also with the implications that it has for all Orthodox in North America. And in the process, obviously, I have to look at some Roman Catholic rights leaders, but I also spend a fair amount of time looking at some people who are influenced by the Reformed tradition of Protestantism, because two or three of those figures have also been sort of major contributors to questions about rights. And so in the latter part of the book, I look at those figures as well, just to, again, to set a context, to say, well, this is the world into which the Orthodox themselves have to navigate and try to be aware of what other people have said and what rights, in a sense, would we affirm with other Christians, and where would we perhaps differ in our understanding. So that's I don't want to spend more time trying to synopsize the book. Be happy to answer questions about that. With regard to the question about sort of why are we perhaps late comers to the discussion and so forth, I think the biggest answer to that has to do with our history. That is, obviously, various strains of Orthodoxy have arrived in North America, and it's a late church, if you will. As I say, we don't really have a full-blown episcopal structure in this part of the world until the late 19th century, and it's not even universally acknowledged. And in addition to that, most of the people who arrive here were, as immigrants, they didn't have access to advanced education. Most of these people are people who are working in either industry or small shops and so forth. So it's later before they began to sort of enter into debates in sort of higher education circles. And I think that's at least a part of the reason why we're sort of, if you will, playing catch up. But I would also, I think at the end, also suggest that one of our problems that we do still have is it's not quite clear whether some Orthodox are even comfortable talking about rights. Some years ago, when I was first starting the project, I was giving a lecture at one of the monasteries in this country, and one of the monastics said, "Well, I don't think the Orthodox have rights. That's the wrong language. We have duties, we have obligations, we have to be servants of the Lord." I said, "Well, no argument there, but in point of fact, you can't get around the rights claims that have been made." But there's a certain hesitancy, I think, to suggest that maybe we do selectively use and profit from the way in which rights claims have been advanced, even though we don't agree with some of the more aggressive secular claims about rights that are now prevalent in some circles in the West. So I want to end actually by pointing out a very interesting letter that I found, a comment I found. I'm going to quote this from the book now. This is a letter actually that was written in 1917. and it's written actually by Raphael Habawini, St. Raphael, whose feast day in the OCA we just actually celebrated today. In that letter, he presents what I would call a remarkably candid approach to his understanding of who he is and what Orthodoxy in North America is about. And it may shed some light on this question about how we view rights and whether we're comfortable with this kind of language. This is what he actually says, quote, "I am an Arab by birth, a Greek by primary education, an American by residence, a Russian at heart, and a Slav in soul." So basically, he's only an American by residence, but his heart actually seems to be somewhere else. Now, obviously, he spent most of his life abroad. It's only in his later years that he becomes a part of the Russian mission. But I think that that kind of mix of identities may shed some light also on, if you will, asking the question about why some people in the Orthodox experience in North America are not quite sure that they are comfortable with rights language and rights claims. And so the book tries to say, or tries to give if you will, a guide to saying, well, if you're going to raise these questions, at least be aware of the background, be aware of the cases, be aware of the disputes before you begin to make your decisions about, how we do or don't fit into the various discussions about rights. Okay, so that's my sort of setup, if you will, for our discussion here. As I said, I don't want to spend any more time lecturing. I think that gives us adequate background for the context of the book and why I wrote it in the first place, and a little bit about myself. So having said that, then I think we should sort of open the discussion.
Great.
All right. Thank you, Deacon Ken. Thank you, Father, for this talk. I'm kind of curious if you get into the intellectual history here, because we Orthodox, we often resist when the Protestants and Catholics get into debates about faith versus works. Like, no, we don't fit into that dichotomy. Or they talk about transubstantiation versus consubstantiation. And it does seem to me, I mean, you're not a lawyer and we are, but there are big intellectual shifts that happen. It's the medieval scholastic shifts that get to the Roman Catholic idea of a right state of affairs. And then it's the Enlightenment that gets us to a Protestant sense of a individual having a right. And I just wonder, how is it that you think we can discuss rights as individual possessions without buying into the kind of methodological individualism that is fundamentally Protestant? I mean, I think it puts us in this awkward position because most of us are citizens of America, a country founded on these methodological assumptions. And so for political and legal purposes, we deal this way. But I understand the monastics' reluctance to kind of buy into a vocabulary that itself presupposes a kind of epistemic and methodological individualism that is just it's fundamentally an Enlightenment construct, and our church is kind of outside of those Enlightenment debates. So how is it that you think that this is I mean, even is it productive? And if it's productive, do the benefits of talking in these terms outweigh the risks of having of our buying into the wrong language or framing of the concept?
The way I guess the way I would have to respond is, besides asking you to read the parts of the book that actually address this issue, I think the problem that we face is that the kind of individualism you're talking about, the argument I make actually is that that's not really present in the 18th century at the time of the founding. If you actually read Jefferson very carefully, Jefferson is actually not nearly as detached or divorced from the medieval legacy as he himself liked to think he was, because he never talks about rights without talking about obligations and responsibilities. There's no such thing as just an absolute individual right that has no connection to obligation. The concept of virtue, public virtue, that was crucial to those people, still basically understood that. Where you get this kind of, I would call sort of radical individualism that's detached from that sense of moral obligation, is really in the post-Civil War period, and I try to document that. So I would say definitely you're quite correct. I mean, to the extent that you get a highly secularized, individualized sense of rights, I think that is alien. But that's not just alien to us. That's alien actually to both Protestant and Catholic thinking historically. So, and again, I mean, I think one has to be very careful about saying it's fine to look at people like Immanuel Kant or the big thinkers of the 19th century, but that's not actually where a lot of Americans draw their convictions from. They really are much more influenced by the Scottish common sense tradition, and I spend a fair amount of time trying to explicate what that tradition represented and how it impacts the discussion about rights until, as I say, this kind of more secular turn that is really late 19th and early 20th century. So that's where I would begin to respond and say you're quite right. I mean, the kind of radical secularized individualism doesn't really fit with us. And if you then start to ask questions about saying, well, where are you going to ground that claim? They get you into even more difficult questions, which I also tried to look at in the book by saying that, the whole question of where you ground rights becomes really very, very complicated. And it's really, in some cases, it's really caused some people to say this is unproductive. I mean, you won't find an adequate grounding for rights in any kind of secular discourse. It just doesn't exist. The only way that you can actually defend human dignity and rights and so forth is through faith. And that's not just an Orthodox statement. There are plenty of Catholic and Protestant theologians who would agree with that. So that's perhaps more than you need to know right now, but that's my response to your question.
Thank you.
Father Anthony, following on that, I wonder if the concept of personhood would shed some light on this question. At our very first OCAN National Gathering in 2017, Bishop Maxime from the Serbian Western Diocese gave a wonderful talk, and he emphasized the distinction between people as individuals and people as persons. And this concept of personhood is pretty important in the Orthodox tradition, although I don't think most lay people understand it very well. Can you explain the concept of personhood in the Orthodox tradition and how that might shed some light on how we as Orthodox attorneys can engage in the discussion of rights?
Well, I try to ground that discussion in the work of the late Metropolitan John Zizulius of blessed memory. I'm very much influenced by Zizulius's whole approach to issues of the church, the Eucharist, episcopacy, is everything else. And he himself gave a couple of addresses to attorneys in Athens before his death, in which he raised this very issue and sort of pointed out that personhood is in fact part of our understanding that the whole nature of being human is in fact that we share in this image and likeness tradition. Now, I would go so far as to say the whole question of personhood is not an entirely resolved issue among Orthodox theologians. I mean, there are serious disagreements among theologians. Father John Baer and Father Metropolitan Zizulius didn't necessarily agree in every sense about claims about personhood, and especially when you try to relate this to Trinitarian theology. And that gets us way off of where we need to be here. But I would say yes, as long as I think we understand that those claims about personhood still really essentially, I think, depend upon a declaration of faith. You can't prove personhood in any sense that would make sense to us. You accept the revelation of God in Christ, and you accept the understanding of what we are called to become. And there's no such thing in that kind of thinking as an isolated individual with some sort of rights claims. I mean, that doesn't make any sense in our understanding of what it means to be fully human. And so, but what Metropolitan Zizulius said was, to the extent that we can, we should actually borrow, and praise any aspect of rights claims that are made outside of the Orthodox tradition, as long as they don't conflict with this understanding of the human person and what we're called to. And I think that's where I would agree and say, we we bring to the table that kind of perception. And that's, again, not something that is entirely unique to us. There certainly are both Catholic theologians today and others who I think are very sympathetic to that emphasis on personhood. So that, again, that's a very brief response, but that's how I would approach it.
Well, we welcome more comments and questions. While we wait to see if anyone else has one, I have another question following up on that. So you said that, yeah, the concept of personhood depends a lot on faith, but of course, so does almost any other concept we want to value, we want to attribute to any argument. And so in this modern secular society where Americans and really the whole modern world is so disjointed in terms of where do we get our basis of notions of right and wrong and individual rights versus obligations. How do we, as anyone with a religious faith, speak in the secular conversation today?
Well, that's a fair question, and I think the responses vary. I mean, I actually cite in the book the sort of conclusions of an Orthodox thinker and writer who has also practiced law, who has suggested that increasingly it's really difficult to see how we can have some of these conversations because the assumptions of an aggressive sort of secularism that really sort of dismisses altogether any kind of sort of religious-based rights claims. It's difficult to say how we can engage that, except to say we're not even in the same room together. We're talking entirely different languages. On the other hand, I think one has to be careful and not assume that kind of really radical position actually represents where the majority of people in the United States are. It's very difficult to get a bead on this kind of question because there are so many contradictory currents that we're dealing with right now. On the one hand, if you've paid attention in the last week or so, there are new surveys out that claim that the sort of de-Christianization of America has plateaued, that basically religion is back, let's put it that way. Well, what does that mean? I mean, you have to spell that out before that has any real consequence. So it is certainly still true that in certain highly prestigious law schools and other places, you have some very aggressive secularists who do not want to acknowledge the role of religion as having any kind of privileged status, anything that would in any way compromise the interest of the state in protecting whatever they claim rights are. But I doubt very much that represents where most Americans seem to be. Whatever this religiosity is that Americans claim to subscribe to, it counts for something. I mean, I think that people are still, in a sense, skeptical in this country about kind of a radical secular claim to saying this is who we are. It doesn't really fit culturally with the history of this country. As you're probably well aware, I mean, there was a 19th century attempt, and I talk about this in the book, to actually amend the Constitution to get the United States to be officially declared a Christian nation. I mean, it failed partly because people in Congress themselves were quite skeptical about this and were leery of anything that would take us back into the connection between church and state that we rejected at the time of the founding. But it's what's funny is that there's a resurgence of that very idea right now, if you believe the pollsters again. There are a lot of people who seem to think that that's exactly what we should do. Well, what does that mean? I mean, how does that affect rights talk and so forth? I mean, does that mean therefore that Christians have special rights and privileges, or does it mean they have special responsibilities? If in fact this is a supposedly Christian nation. From the Orthodox perspective, obviously, we would say, well, no, I mean, this is not a Christian nation, certainly not an Orthodox nation. And if it were to become so, what would that mean? Would we actually want a connection to state power and so forth? I mean, that hasn't necessarily served the church all that well historically, and it would be very difficult to reconcile with our own traditions of the last several hundred years. So I think, again, I would be cautious before assuming that we have no basis for talking to people outside of our own faith tradition. But you do have to know who your interlocutor is. I mean, you have to actually get some sense of where they're coming from. And in some cases, I think you would find that there are highly sympathetic Catholic and Protestant voices who would be very happy to sort of join with the Orthodox on certain issues, and in other cases it wouldn't work. So again, I mean, that sounds a bit weasel worded, but it is a case by case issue, I think.
Yes, thank you. We have a couple of questions. How about Joseph?
Thank you, Father and Deacon, for taking my question. I wanted to ask, to what extent do you think the language of rights is inherently selfish, I guess, and kind of inherently individualistic, such that, it is over and against the community when you assert it as a concept? To what extent do you think that is kind of inherently baked into the concept of rights?
I would disagree. I don't think there's any reason to suggest that that's the case at all. It can become that and has become that in more modern times, but historically, I would say that's not the case. There was, and I try to go into this in some detail, starting all the way back with Roman law's understanding of subjective rights, and then the question of how rights are connected to obligations. And there's in the large tradition from ancient through medieval and early modern times, rights are always cast within the context of belonging to a community to which you have obligations. There's no such thing as just a right that just sort of floats out there somewhere. That, I think, is, as I just said, I think that's a very recent sort of creation and delusion. And I try fairly at some detail to sort of explain, in a sense, where those discussions come from, and what those, particularly the medieval Catholic disputants about rights claims, why in fact that was so intense, and where people tried to locate the concept of rights coupled to obligation and coupled to what your standing was in a community. So I think as long as that perspective is maintained, then I can't see why you would claim that the concept of rights is just inherently individualistic. I think it has become that in the hands of some people, but I don't think it has historically. I'd say that's a wrong understanding. That's simply not the way it worked.
Thank you. Question from Logan.
Hello, thank you for letting me speak, Father and Deacon. I am I'm doing my undergrad right now for schooling, and one topic that came up recently in my U.S. government class was we had to either defend or promote the death penalty, and I took the sorry, not defend or promote, defend or deny the death penalty, and I took the denial position. In my debate, doing research, I noticed that there were many different views from the different jurisdictions on the death penalty, with some going as far as denouncing it, like if I remember correctly, the OCA and the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese. I'm just curious, what would be a more unified Orthodox view on the death penalty? Is that a right to life that we have, and does that carry over into I guess, abortion and other topics such as that?
Sure. Well, the quick answer to that is that I think your last comment basically begins to frame it correctly. I think the way most Orthodox theologians would approach this question would be to say that it is part of the sort of dignity and the rights of all human beings, and therefore to engage in violence, whether it's against the fetus, or whether it's against the aged, or whether it's against the criminal, really gets you into very, very serious problems. The question is how do you defend this from an Orthodox understanding of the dignity of the human person and the sanctity of life? To a certain degree, I'd say some, maybe perhaps most Orthodox ethicists that I know of would talk in language that would be similar to what the Roman Catholic Church has increasingly said, which is that there's a kind of seamless robe of dignity that applies to the person from conception to death, and that there cannot be a justification for taking that life. Now, again, not everybody agrees with that. There are some people who are still trying to say that there are such heinous kinds of crimes that simply seem to call for the state to take the life of the perpetrator. But I think on the whole, I would risk the generalization that that's not the position that is being taken by most of the bioethicists that I know of, and the people who write on the question of the sanctity of life, as I say, from beginning to end. So that's a real quick answer.
Thank you, Father. Burke?
Hi, Father. I was curious as to whether you had any thoughts on how a potential recognition of the U.S. as a Christian nation at the constitutional level could theoretically function not so much as a grant of an individual right to any particular person, but rather as an additional check on the power of the government, of the federal government in toto.
Well, I would probably risk my generalization as an historian to say that my reading of the past, from the time of the official recognition of Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire under Theodosius, and the later manifestations, and I don't care whether we're talking about the medieval Rus or the Serbian Empire or any other variety of it, no matter how much the church has perhaps tried to claim for itself a kind of independence from the powers of the state, it generally hasn't worked that way. It's the church that has basically been compromised as a result of that. Power and wealth simply are very difficult bedfellows for the church to get in bed with. And, Augustine warned about this repeatedly in his own musings about the relationship of the church to empire. So I'm not optimistic, let's put it that way, that making a declaration that we're a Christian nation somehow puts a check on how power and wealth might be abused. Declarations are only as good, after all, as the willingness of people to act upon them. And you can put anything down on paper; it doesn't necessarily have consequence. So my fear is that, again, from an historical standpoint, every time this has happened, what usually results is that religious minorities of some kind who are not identified as part of as being in the tent are going to get short shrift. And their rights are not going to be respected, and so I would be deeply skeptical about the chances that we would have if we made that declaration that this was going to somehow contain and guide or direct the exercise of power in a way that we as Orthodox would like to see. So that's my as I say, my deeply skeptical view as an historian of looked at this sort of thing in various contexts.
So is the First Amendment as good as it gets?
Well, the First Amendment is an enormous step forward, and if you look again historically at the whole problem of how we move from toleration, which is just basically saying we'll put up with your silly religious ideas even though we don't like them, to the actual point of saying, the state simply does not have any business trying to dictate religious belief or practice. And now that gets difficult in practical applications, but it's a huge step, unlike anything really that went before it. And of course was something that Madison and Jefferson were particularly adamant about, precisely because they would have, I think, agreed with what I just said. The historical record is a miserable one. The church basically ends up being an instrument of oppression and terror. It's always on the side of the wealthy and the powerful, and the ordinary people get the short end of the stick. And I'll just say, just as a footnote to that, one of the things I try to do in the beginning of the book is to look at what happens to the bishops in the period of the 3rd, 4th, 5th century, as they themselves become incorporated into the judicial structure of the empire, and they begin to exercise the role as judges and arbitrators. And they themselves lament this because they see how compromised they can easily become, because it's only the wealthy and the powerful who actually were able to utilize those courts to any degree. Ordinary people had no hope of bringing a case to litigation or to a adjudication before a bishop. And the bishops were acutely aware that this was not a role that they were very happy about, but they, in a sense, had no options either. And what they tried to do was to mitigate the savagery of Roman law, which was really quite savage in terms of the use of torture and so forth. But they were deeply aware of just how morally compromised they felt at times, at least in the cases that survive, where we can actually see what they did and when they make comment on it.
Father, if I could go back to your answer to the previous question, you talked about the concept of dignity. I think the phrase human dignity is fairly new in the discourse on rights, and it's one that I just recently came across. Can you explain more about what that concept means, and is that something that we as Orthodox can embrace?
Well, that again, I try to do something with this in the chapters in the book. I probably would say that this is at the risk of gross generalization, it's a development of the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century among certain philosophers. So it doesn't really start as a theological point. It really is a set of reflections on the part of certain philosophers who began to talk about the human person and about the dignity of human beings. Partly, of course, this gets then accelerated profoundly by the events of the 1930s and 40s. It really is in that context, with the kinds of horrors unleashed by the Holodomor in Ukraine, and the savagery of the Holocaust, the insistence that we have to find some way of talking about all human beings as having some kind of dignity, regardless of their religious or their ethnic or their whatever standing you want to talk about. That really is where that discussion really becomes increasingly intense, and so the dignity of the human person is something that since that time forward, various people, sociologists, philosophers, other people have been struggling with, to say, well, if we're going to talk about human dignity again, where do we ground this? In what sense can we find a basis for claiming that there is a kind of basic human dignity that everyone shares in? And responses to that will vary, of course. There's no one simple area, but I think that undoubtedly there have been Orthodox theologians who would certainly be sympathetic to this, and would say this is worthy of our attention. And then we need to articulate on the basis of what we would say as Orthodox. How do we ground the importance of the dignity of the human person? And again, for us, I think this would immediately pull us back into the theology of image and likeness. So I think it's an integral part of that whole discussion, put it that way.
That's great. Thank you. Well, we're coming up on the hour. I know you really like to hear feedback on your book from Orthodox attorneys. Would you like people to email you with questions and
Be
comments?
fine. Yes, that'd be fine. No, I'd be
wonderful.
grateful. As I say, the book has been out about a year. Reviews of the book in professional journals are just now starting to appear, so I don't really have a great deal of response yet, and that's pretty much the way this works. I mean, it takes time for things to work through the publishing process and so forth. But I know the book is out for review in several law journals, as well as journals that focus on religion and so forth, both here and abroad. So I'll be hopefully collecting those. But I would in fact appreciate hearing from Orthodox practitioners of law in North America, because after all, the book is primarily, despite all the background work that I do, it's primarily focused on and interested in the Orthodox in North America. And so as North American Orthodox attorneys who are in practice, yes, I'd be very pleased to hear anything you choose to share with me.
And I'd love to hear comments and engage in a dialogue on these issues. If any of you would like to continue the conversation, I welcome you to join our Facebook group or our LinkedIn group, both of which are private groups, so only open to Orthodox attorneys. So, you can feel free to share your thoughts openly among our members. You can just go to LinkedIn and Facebook and Google, search for Orthodox Christian Attorney Network. I want to thank Father Anthony so much for his time and sharing his thoughts and initiating a very important discussion that I'd like to, continue within OCAN. If you would like to stick around for a few more minutes, just to continue chit-chatting, I will stick around, and if Father wants to stick around, we can do that. But I do want to respect everyone's time, so we'll officially bring this to a close. Father, do you have any final parting words for us?
Just to say thank you again. I'm very pleased that you managed to arrange this. As I say, I certainly would welcome any responses you choose to send my way. That's always helpful. I don't anticipate writing the book again, but I might actually have occasion to either comment or if not retract, then maybe modify anything that I might have said. If anybody sort of has any suggestions or sort of suggestions that I might need to think about expanding upon. This does come up. Obviously, I've taught this book actually to the seminarians at St. Vladimir's, and they all agree it's an extremely challenging read. But their responses were quite positive, so that was hopeful. But as I say, I'd be particularly interested in the responses of those of you who are practitioners of the law.